At my own daughter's engagement party, my ex-wife's new husband raised his glass, looked straight at me, and called me a broke old digger who never amounted to much. Everyone laughed. Even my daughter smiled, a little awkwardly, and let it go. What none of them knew, not my ex-wife, not her husband, not even my own daughter, was that I still owned 49% of the company he was so proud of. A company he thought he'd built entirely on his own. I raised my glass right back at him, smiled, and said nothing. But by the end of that financial year, he was going to understand exactly who he'd been laughing at.
My name's Ray, different Ray to the road train driver, if you've seen that story, though I reckon we'd get along fine over a beer. I'm 66 years old, and for most of my working life, I ran a small precision engineering business out of a workshop in Bayswater, on the eastern side of Melbourne. Nothing glamorous. We made custom parts for the mining and agricultural industry, mostly, components other companies couldn't be bothered machining themselves. I built that business from a single rented shed in 1986 with $11,000 I'd saved from 3 years of shift work, and by the time I was 40, it had grown into something with a genuine reputation across Victoria. My marriage to Diane didn't survive the growing of it, unfortunately. That's an old story, and not really the point of this one, so I'll be brief about it. We divorced when our daughter, Sophie, was 12. It wasn't ugly, not in the way some divorces are, no screaming matches, no court battles over the business, because by mutual agreement, and on the advice of a very good solicitor named Jeff who I still see for a beer twice a year, I kept full operational control of the company, but Diane retained a financial interest in it. 49%, structured as non-voting shares, part of the property settlement instead of a lump sum I didn't have sitting around at the time. It was fair. I want to be clear about that. Diane had supported me through the early, brutal years of building that business, answering phones from our kitchen table, doing the books for free before we could afford a bookkeeper. She was entitled to a share of what we'd built together, even after the marriage itself ended. What none of us anticipated, back in 1998 when that settlement was finalized, was who Diane would eventually marry, or what he'd eventually do with a business he didn't fully understand he only half controlled. Diane remarried about 6 years after our divorce, a man named Barry, a smooth sort of fellow who'd made his money in commercial real estate around the Mornington Peninsula. I never had much to do with him personally, beyond the occasional handover of Sophie for a weekend, a nod at a school function. He always struck me as the type who measured a man's worth by the car he drove and the address on his letterhead, and by that measure, I imagine I looked fairly unremarkable to him, a bloke in stained overalls who owned some kind of little workshop business, as I once overheard him describe it to a friend at Sophie's Year 12 graduation. Here's where it gets complicated, and where the story really starts. About 11 years ago, my health took a hit, a heart scare, nothing fatal in the end, but serious enough that my cardiologist and my own common sense told me it was time to step back from the day-to-day running of the business. I was 55. I didn't want to sell the company outright. It was still turning a healthy profit, and Sophie, at the time, had expressed some interest in eventually taking it over herself, though she was still finishing her commerce degree and wasn't ready yet. So I did something that, in hindsight, set the whole rest of this story in motion. I brought in a managing director to run daily operations, a capable young engineer named Colin, and I stepped back into a much quieter, largely silent role, chairman on paper, majority shareholder, but almost entirely hands-off. I trusted Colin. I still do, actually, which matters for later. What I didn't fully account for was that Diane, over the following few years, quietly transferred a portion of her voting rights, though crucially, not her actual shareholding, to Barry, giving him a formal role advising and eventually managing certain aspects of the family's investment in the business, as he liked to call it. He never bought a single share. He never invested a single dollar of his own money. But somewhere along the way, in his own mind and increasingly in the way he spoke to other people, Barry began describing the business as something he'd essentially built and rescued, turned around, in his words, from what he characterized as years of stagnation under its previous, unambitious ownership. I let that slide for years, mate, if I'm honest with you. I genuinely didn't care much about the credit. I had my own quiet life by then, a small place out near Healesville, a fair bit of fishing, regular dinners with Sophie whenever she was free. The business ran well under Colin. The dividends came through twice a year, steady and unremarkable, and I honestly gave very little thought to what Barry was telling people at his golf club. That changed at Sophie's engagement party. It was held at a function centre out toward the Yarra Valley. Lovely spot, vineyard views, the kind of place that costs a small fortune to hire for an afternoon. I was there, obviously, proud as anything, watching my daughter, 28 years old by then, absolutely glowing next to her fiancé, a decent young bloke named Tom who worked in agricultural science. Diane was there. Barry was there, holding court near the bar with a group of Tom's relatives, telling stories, the way he always did. At some point during the speeches, Barry got up, not officially on the program, mind you, he just took it upon himself, and made some remarks about family, about hard work, about the importance of a man providing properly for the people he loves. And then, gesturing loosely in my direction, glass of Yarra Valley Pinot in hand, he said, with a laugh that pulled the whole room in with him, "Not that we've all managed that equally well, hey Ray? Still driving that same old ute, I hear. Some blokes just don't have the head for building something real." A few people laughed, the uncomfortable kind of laugh you give when you're not entirely sure if something's a joke. Sophie's smile went thin. Diane looked down at her plate, and I just sat there for a moment, glass in hand, and felt something very calm and very clear settle over me. I want to pause here on a small emotional beat, because it matters. It wasn't the insult itself that got under my skin. 66 years old, mate, you develop a fairly thick hide about that sort of thing. What actually stung was watching my own daughter, on one of the most important days of her life, quietly absorb the idea, even for a moment, even without fully believing it, that her father hadn't built something real. I raised my glass to Barry, gave him a small, genuine-looking smile, and said, "Fair point, Barry. Cheers." And that was it. I didn't say another word about it that day. Here's what I did instead, over the following 6 weeks, calmly and without any drama at all. First, I rang Colin, my managing director, and asked for a full, current breakdown of the company's shareholding structure and voting arrangements, something I was fully entitled to as majority shareholder, but hadn't formally reviewed in years. Colin, decent bloke that he is, sent it through within a day, along with a slightly awkward note mentioning that Barry's been asking a fair bit about long-term strategy lately, more than I'd have expected. Second, I called Jeff, my solicitor, the same one who'd handled the original divorce settlement, and asked him a simple question. Given that Barry held no actual shares, only a limited advisory arrangement granted informally by Diane, what would happen to that arrangement if, say, the majority shareholder, me, formally reasserted active involvement in strategic decisions, something entirely within my rights? Jeff, being Jeff, laughed and said, "Ray, you could dissolve that arrangement with a single letter if you wanted to. He's got no actual standing. He's been operating on borrowed authority the whole time." Third, and this is the part that took the longest, about 5 weeks in total, I quietly arranged a series of meetings with Colin and the senior leadership team, not to make any dramatic announcement, but simply to reintroduce myself, properly, as an active chairman again. Nothing hostile. I sat in on strategy meetings. I reviewed contracts I'd have normally left entirely to Colin. I asked considered questions about a proposed expansion into South Australia that Barry, it turned out, had been quietly steering, a fairly aggressive, debt-funded expansion that Colin, to his credit, had already been nervous about. I formally paused that expansion pending my own review. Within the terms of the original shareholder agreement, that was entirely my right to do, and Barry had no actual authority to override it, whatever he'd been telling people at the golf club. Then, at the next scheduled shareholders meeting, a fairly dry, procedural affair usually attended by almost nobody outside Colin, myself, and Diane's accountant, I attended in person for the first time in nearly 6 years. Barry showed up too, uninvited in any formal sense, but Diane had apparently mentioned it to him, and he arrived with the easy confidence of a man who believed he already ran the place. I let him talk for the first 20 minutes or so. He outlined his vision for the South Australian expansion with real enthusiasm, real Polish. I'll give him that much, the man can present. When he finished, I simply asked, calmly, "Barry, can you clarify for the room what your formal role is in this company, in terms of actual shareholding?" There was a long pause. Diane looked uncomfortable. Colin studied his notes very intently. And Barry, for the first time since I'd known him, seemed to genuinely struggle to find his usual smooth footing. "I've been advising," he said eventually. Informally, through Diane's arrangement. "Right," I said. "And Diane holds 49%, non-voting on operational matters, as per the original settlement. Which means I still hold majority voting control of this company. Which means, going forward, decisions of this scale go through me directly, not through an informal advisory arrangement." I said all of this without any edge to my voice at all. Just fact, laid out plainly, the way you'd read out a set of engineering tolerances. I paused the South Australian expansion entirely. Within 4 months, once a proper independent review came back, it turned out the numbers Barry had been presenting were considerably more optimistic than reality supported. The kind of expansion that would have put the whole company at serious financial risk within 18 months had it gone ahead unchecked. Diane, to her credit, once she saw the actual figures, quietly withdrew her support for Barry's continued involvement in the business altogether. I don't know the full details of what happened between them after that, and it's genuinely not my business, but Barry's name hasn't come up at a family function since. Sophie called me about 2 weeks after that shareholders meeting. Colin had apparently mentioned something to her, in passing, about your dad sorting out that whole expansion mess. She asked me, a little carefully, what had actually happened. So I told her, calmly, the same way I'd told the room. Not to make myself look good, and not to make Barry look bad for the sake of it, but because she deserved to understand, finally, what her father had actually spent 30 years building, quietly, without ever needing to talk about it at parties. She went quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have said something at the engagement party. I just didn't know." I told her there was nothing to apologize for. That's the thing about quiet men, mate. We don't always make it easy for people to know what we've actually done. That's on us, sometimes, as much as anyone else. These days, the business is doing better than it has in years. Steady, sensible growth, no debt-funded gambles, Colin running things with my quiet oversight exactly the way it should be. Sophie's wedding went ahead beautifully last spring, out at a proper vineyard venue this time, funded partly, though she doesn't know the full extent of it, by her old man's dividends. Diane and I are civil, more than civil actually, genuinely friendly in a way we probably weren't during the marriage itself. And Barry, well, Barry still turns up occasionally to family things, quieter now, considerably more careful about what he says over a glass of Pinot. I never raised my voice through any of it. I never once reminded him, out loud, of exactly who still owned half of everything he'd been so proud of. I didn't need to. Some men learn who you really are through an argument. Others only learn it through the numbers, laid out plainly on a page, in a language they suddenly can't talk their way around. That's the story, mate. Not hot anger. Just a quiet bloke, reasserting exactly what was always his to begin with, and a man who learned, rather late, that it's a dangerous thing to underestimate a broke old digger who happens to still own 49% of your golf club stories.